Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, students. I hope you're all doing well as we approach this third week of micro and macroeconomics. The professor's comments this week will briefly detail some of the connections that we should be able to now draw as economic thinkers. Again, as we look at the world that we live in and the decisions that we make, one of the common themes that we found up to this point is that every decision has a cost, right? So in our intellectual mind, one of the things we want to make sure to begin to do is to really ask ourselves the question as to how useful are the economic models and graphs that we've been introduced? How useful are they in our world? I would lament very useful if you're an economist, if you have the thought process of inquisitiveness of how prices and quantities are established, first and foremost. And I shouldn't say first and foremost, but obviously price and quantities that's the key. Those are the two variables that we're looking at today, or in week 3, is the variable of price. Again, a variable is any unit measurable that changes. So I digress. Chapter 2, we talked about variables such as production possibility opportunities. One of the things that we should have seen as we watched the videos, and most of you did this in your discussion post, was that you can't be in two places at one time. So as a society looks to develop its production possibility frontier and or curve, it's important to identify that because of limited resources, you can build planes with all of the resources, all of the factors of production, or you can build hamburgers. You can do all of one or all of the other, right? However, the goal obviously is to have some form of a mix. And that mix is then determined by the calculation of opportunity cost. Now, opportunity cost, as we review, stated that a country or a firm or a person should produce the good at which his opportunity cost of producing the alternate good is the smallest. As you students have to compare, maybe I know one of my students compared Japan and the US, and she clearly depicted that the US could make X number of planes or X number of wheat, and Japan could produce X number of planes or X number of wheat. But of course, if we look at that, one of those countries are going to have what we might call an advantage. Right? You might say to yourself, well, Japan has an advantage in producing cars because, their technological ingenuity is very high. I don't want to call it superior to ours, but it's very, very high. And they've learned how to make cars well, efficiently. I guess you might say, well, that depends on who you are, Professor Young. I believe Ford produces cars well, and you would be right. Others of you might say, I believe Buick produces cars well. You'd probably be right? But the point I'm trying to make here is that if you have these two countries that produce cars, it's advantageous as economists if we identify who makes the item maybe not superior, but who makes most of the items or a quantity of the items, giving up some smaller unit of something else that they're not producing, we would indicate that they have what they call a comparative advantage. So the important point is that now that we've identified who has a comparative advantage in producing goods or services, given our hypothetical situations, now we're going to talk about how prices are derived. Now, on the macro side of the house, macroeconomics, prices are derived by virtue of Professor Young or you saying bottled water is $1.99. It is what we say it is, right? In macro sense. But in the micro sense, bottled water is a byproduct of how much it costs to make the water. Okay, but today I'm going to conflate, this week I'm going to conflate those two ideas and say we're going to say that price is what it is because we say it is. Now, those of you in microeconomics will get into what we call the total cost formula soon. That is, total cost is equal to variable cost plus fixed costs, which equals TC, or total cost. Now, I don't want you to be too confused there. I'll say that again. The total cost formula in microeconomics is fixed cost plus variable cost equals total cost. And so we'll look at that more specifically when we start to talk about market structures in the microeconomics course. But in macro, and for the sake of argument, we all are in macro, the macro domain now, price is what it is because we say it is. So bottled water, $1.99. This bottled water that you see on my screen here. So then we ask ourselves, well, how many things are we going to purchase? How many things will the society need? Well, let's take a step back and say, well, under the production possibility curve, efficiently, there was production of maybe 100 bottles of water and 50 hamburgers on the production possibility curve and or frontier. So we'll take from that the quantity. This is why we look at production possibility frontiers first before we look at supply and demand, because we have to answer the fundamental questions of the how, the what, the for whom, the when. And embedded in that too is going to be the why. Especially as we look at our society today, we say, well, why do we have all these masks that are being produced? Well, we're in a pandemic. Masks were not even on the map before the pandemic, not to the degree that they are now. I mean, I think I have like 4 different mask types and $15 a piece, right? I actually bought some special ones for my wife and I that I think they were $20 a piece and they didn't fit, right? You might say, well, send them back. I did. But my point is that now when we say the how, well, we'll get to that. The why, because there's individuals in our society that need things, right? The what, okay, we'll say mask and or Black Lives Matter t-shirts and or suits and or Jaguars and or hamburgers, again, and or computers. The why inherently is in the fact that our society is a consumption society. We consume things. So in order for that to have that circular flow model, that circular motion, as I mentioned in week 1, then we need to know or answer these questions. Keep in mind that as I lecture on this or talk to you about this in terms of my comments, I want to make sure to go back and grab some of the items that we discussed and show you how relevant they are today and really put on the emphasis point that you really read chapter 3 slowly, carefully, and read it twice. And be mindful of the graphs that you see. Be open to the opportunity that some of these graphs you might say, well, no, this is nonsense. This doesn't make sense that demand is downward sloping. That is, as price drops, people buy more. Some of you may say, well, agree with supply as a supplier. They want to increase the price and sell more goods. Right? However, the equilibrium is where our society, that's where the transaction point occurs. Okay? Point is, again, as you read this chapter, you're going to identify things that we call supply determinants and demand determinants. And these are going to be the items that are going to do something significant, or shall I say, have a critical impact on whether or not the graph stays stagnant and doesn't move or shift, or whether or not it shifts. Okay? So when we look at the demand side of the market, again, this is a linear line that we might assign a demand equation. Okay, remember earlier we talked about y equals a plus bx, and we said that that was the slope-intercept formula. We also talked about the fact that the y is the dependent variable, the a is the vertical intercept, the b is the slope, and the x is the independent variable. So in the case if we were using the demand side, we would say that an equation would say is P is equal to 50 minus 2x. Okay? Again, I say P being, the independent variable, or should I say the dependent variable, is equal to 50 minus 5x. So why do I say minus? Well, because the demand curve is downward sloping, thus the linear equation has a minus in the middle of the equation. On the flip side of that, the supply side formula would say, P is equal to 20 plus 10x. Right? So downward sloping, the minus sign is in the formula. Upward sloping, the positive sign is in the formula. Right, so this is why I asked you in the discussion board, I said, so what is the usefulness of the y equals a plus bx formula? Now, a lot of you will know that formula as y equals mx plus b. But you'll notice I did not structure the formula that way because in economics, we move the variables around a bit and we change the alphas. So remember, y is equal to a plus or minus bx. Now, on its face, you won't have to do supply and demand equations in Chapter 3, but you will see them in Chapter 4. So I would Google supply and demand equations. Okay? Furthermore, the effect of demand and supply shifts on equilibrium. That's the key focus of this chapter. It's understanding what shifts the curves. So to analyze the market for premium bottled water, I used water as an example earlier, we need a model of how buyers and sellers behave. Once again, for my micro students, the model we use in this chapter is a perfectly competitive market. Okay? Again, perfectly competitive means that it's a market with many buyers and sellers. All firms are selling identical products, and there are no barriers to entry or exit. Moreover, more importantly, no barriers to new firms entering the market. I mean, of course, exit is going to happen just by attrition, natural attrition. So while these assumptions are quite restrictive, the model is still useful for analyzing markets. So we begin by looking at the demand curve. And as I mentioned earlier, the demand curve would be a situation where we said y is equal to a minus bx. The downward sloping curve means that there's an inverse relationship between variable price and quantity variable. So this demand curve says that ceteris paribus, all things being equal, okay, the relationship between the two are inverse. That is, the requirements that when analyzing the relationship between two variables, such as price and quantity, other variables must be held constant. And what we mean by that is right now, we're not considering anything else other than the fact that there's bottled water that we're interested in purchasing, and there's a price and there's a quantity. No other factors are included. Now you're going to say to me, well, Professor Young, there's no way that not other things are going to be included. I know. I'm just saying be patient on the inclusion of those things because, as I mentioned earlier, those items are going to be called factors of production, or moreover, please forgive me, determinants of demand. Determinants are going to impact the variability or the amount that people will buy. I must also say that these determinants of demand are not the only thing that's going to cause some change in the demand curve, or it's going to look structurally different. But as you can see here, the price dropping from $2.50 to $2. You see the slope there is 50 cents over 1, right? If we go from $2.50 to $2, we're moving down 50 cents increments and we're moving over 1. Okay, so technically that slope there would be down 0.5 over 1. So if we were developing an equation, that's where we would get the slope factor from. Okay, but the point I want to make is that anytime there is a price change from $2.50 to $2, we say that this is a change in quantity demanded. Now there's two significant call-outs here. A change in quantity demanded is when the price drops, but a change in demand is when the demand curve shifts, and we include what we might call a determinant. Okay, so what you see here pictured is a change in quantity demanded. And you'll see here that as the price drops from 50 cents, the quantity demanded increases by 1. But we also have a demand schedule on the left side. Right? And so this is why I had you actually, do a discussion board on developing production possibilities, because truly we can see here that both of these values are moving in diopose fashions. One is decreasing while the other one is increasing. Right? So with that in mind, now we know that a demand curve will always look this way. Okay. So again, as a definition, quantity demanded. That is the amount of good or service that a consumer is willing and able to purchase at a given price. So right now at $2.50, the quantity demanded is 3. At $2, the quantity demanded is 4. If we move from $2.50 to $2, the change in quantity demanded is 1. Right? 3 to 4. So this law of demand rule states that holding everything else constant, when a price of a product falls, the quantity demanded of the product will increase. Again, ceteris paribus, or some of you may say cateris paribus, all things being equal. So as the price falls, there's two things that are happening, and I won't call them countervailing, where they're actually going in opposed fashions. But these things are happening by virtue of the fact that if the price of the good falls, consumers will substitute and buy more of those goods. And if you're in a situation where you have limited income. But more importantly, as the price of goods falls, the purchasing power that we have will rise. So we call the first one the substitution effect, which is the change in the quantity demanded of a good that results from the change in price, making the good more or less expensive relative to the other goods that are substituted. And these are just points of definition. You'll see this on the quiz somewhere. You'll say, well, the substitution effect is, right? So if the price of goods and services go up, the substitution effect says that people will buy less. If the price of goods and services go down, the substitution effect says that people will buy more of that good. They will substitute away from higher priced items. Conversely, or shall I say in the similar fashion, the income effect says that the change in the quantity demand of a good that results from the effect of the change in the good's price on a consumer's purchasing power. In particular, if the price of the good drops, the income effect is increased. You're able to buy more goods. If the quantity or the price of the good increases, the income effect becomes negative. You buy less goods. But remember, these are just states of being when the price moves. Okay? Or shall I say, not states of being, but call-outs or characteristics or market effects. Okay, in terms of what people might do. So now you have these two cases. You have a situation where the demand curve can shift to the right or it can shift to the left. And as I mentioned earlier, what drives a shift in the demand curve is what is going to be linked to what we call a determinant of demand. So remember that, because this week's discussions post will require you to identify determinants of demand and determinants of supply. On the flip side, and I'll let you go through these PowerPoint slides, this is what you should do during the week. On the flip side of that, you have a supply curve. The supply curve says something slightly different. The supply curve says the suppliers want to raise the price or increase the price and sell more goods. So earlier we had quantities demanded, now we have quantities supplied. And you have some definitions that you can apply there. The focal point is, again, as I mentioned, and I'll give you just a quick snapshot of the determinants of supply. Now, I did not show you the determinants of demand. What you should do immediately after you watch this film or this video is go and find what are the determinants of demand. Because those are the things that are going to shift the demand curve and bring about a change in demand. Okay. Similarly, these factors of production are going to impact, or moreover, these determinants, please excuse me, are going to impact the supply line and whether or not it shifts to the right or to the left. Okay, so again, one takeaway. Let's find out what the determinants of demand are. Write those down on a piece of paper. And then you want to determine what the determinants of supply are. Write those down on a piece of paper. And then you want to go back and you want to look at the homework in my econ lab and see where these questions are expanded upon. Lastly, before we end, again, this is the point of existence for our society. We say, I shouldn't say our society, well, when we consider a particular good, maybe bottles of water. I mentioned earlier the bottle of water costs $1.99, but let's just say here that the bottle of water costs $1.50. The equilibrium point is 150, and the quantity equilibrium point is 5. Now again, these are just two specific variable points, which gives us the ability to identify a market in equilibrium. Of course, we'll talk more about, or you students will read more about what happens when the price drops. Well, when the price drops, the line is down here now. Demand is going to increase and supply is going to decrease. This is a shortage area down here when the price drops. Okay, if the price goes up, then there's going to be a surplus. So more suppliers are going to want to sell, less demanders are going to want to buy. So there's going to be a surplus area in the top here. Okay. All right. I'll keep it there for now. All right. I would say that at minimum in the first couple of days of this week, you want to read the chapter all the way up to at least 3.4. I will do another screencast-o-matic by the end of this week. Keep in mind that I'm still grading your discussion boards. Remember, if you hear this video, that it is vital that you do your peer-reviewed post with the intent to learn. And moreover, the intent to expand your peers' knowledge about things. Right? So as you go into your discussion boards, which I will show here just a couple of things that I've graded thus far in this particular class, it's very important that you give me some expanded discussion on the matter, right? And then as you do that, you want to critique your peers and give them something to think about. Don't just say, oh, good job, that you did great, I love your example. Give them more, right? Because especially if you know and have some examples that you provided, you want to provide academic critique, right? So that's vitally important. The other point is that I'm still grading your discussion boards, and so you'll notice here, like in this class, I've removed the grades for now because I don't want students emailing me every hour on the hour. Again, I'm working on these things, but it takes a little time to read your discussion boards because I want to do a thorough job and maximize your points. The other thing that I'm finding is that a lot of students aren't doing their peer review posts. As a result, they're getting very, very low scores on their posts. Some students are forgetting to include the key terms where we have to bold, and please do not use yellow as your bolding color. I can't see that, right? It really should be a dark color, or you can highlight it, but don't make the font yellow. And then the other thing, so as I mentioned, your patience is necessary. So when you look at your page, some of you, and again, I should have all the things from week 1 graded here in the next day or so. When you look at your Canvas shell, you'll notice you won't be able to see your grade. That's because your professor is working on them. Okay? So do your due diligence to do the best that you can on your discussion boards. Make sure to take a look at the rubric and the syllabus. Don't be late on your discussion boards. And keep in mind, it's important to expand your conversation and expand your discussion when you do a peer review post. Okay? All right. I hope this video is received in a positive note from my students. And you have a great week. And email me if you have questions.